Hello, good evening and welcome to another program on Law and Order. Now, as humans, every human knows that there is some right that we have whether we live in Sri Lanka or whether we live in another country. These rights might change depending on the country you live, but we do have some inherited rights called human rights. The legality of human rights came into being by a document called Magna Carta about 800 years ago in UK. That was the first time human rights were recognized. But since then up to now, how has it developed? What are the human rights we have now? Is it the same as the fundamental rights or is it different? Sometimes we tend to mix these two. Tonight, we are going to tackle and go to the root of the matter and find out what exactly are human rights that we are entitled to as citizens of Sri Lanka and how we can go about protecting them and what we can do when they are violated and questions and issues revolving around that. For this, I have invited once again to the studio an expert on this, Ambika Satguranathan. She is a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka and a qualified attorney in this area. Ambika, thank you very much for coming back for the show. And we had a lovely discussion last time about women's rights and lots of areas you and I didn't disagree. Hopefully we'll agree in human rights. Right. Like I said in my introduction, what is a human right? Or is it started only with the Magna Carta or is it goes beyond that?
Okay, what are human rights? Human rights are rights that are inherent to each one of us. And if you look at, the modern era, we can, I think, for instance, people like Justice Veeramantri have actually looked at the different religions and cultures and tried to trace back the notion of rights, as you said, in the past. But if we look at the modern era, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that, post World War II came into being.
Right.
Which is now understood to be customary international law. So
Right.
customary international law means that it has been practiced and accepted by all the nations so that, it becomes custom and everyone accepts it. So the UDHR, as we call it, includes all these rights. Some of those rights have then be internationally, we have come up with special conventions, what are called conventions,
right,
on specific rights. So we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We have another one on elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. We have the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We have on economic, social and cultural rights. So those are international conventions. And what happens is that countries can sign up to them and ratify them. By doing that, what you are agreeing to is you're agreeing to accept all the rights that are included in that convention.
Right.
So Sri Lanka, for instance, has a great ratification record.
Right.
We have ratified pretty much nearly all the international conventions and treaties. So if we move from the international to the national sphere and we look at Sri Lanka, we have the Constitution. And in the Constitution, we have the Fundamental Rights Chapter. Now, certain rights are included in the Fundamental Rights Chapter, but not all rights. So, for instance, we have the right to equality, the right not to be discriminated against, then we have freedom from torture, freedom of expression, association, assembly is also protected, freedom against or right not to be arbitrarily arrested, that is protected, freedom of movement. So, certain rights are included in the Fundamental Rights Chapter of our Constitution.
Right.
So these are rights that are inherent to both you and me, to all of us.
All of us.
Yeah.
Right. You said there we have basically as a good track record of signing into all these charters, but as you know, you have to make domestic law
That's
of
right.
that to be applicable.
That's
have
right.
we made sufficient domestic law for these human rights to take effect in Sri Lanka?
Well, I think
Other areas we
need to because even if we take, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we do have the ICCPR Act, but that act only includes certain rights that are in the ICCPR. Recently, we've ratified about a year or a year and a half ago, we ratified the Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances, and about 2 weeks ago, Parliament passed a law to enabling legislation to bring that into domestic law.
Right.
So I think we have done that to a certain extent, but our track record actually, I mean, we could improve on that, on passing enabling legislation.
That enabling legislation which was passed in 2 years ago, are you satisfied with that local act?
Which one?
Which you just mentioned?
The 2 weeks ago,
Yes, yes.
the enforced disappearances.
Yes.
That actually, when it was in bill form,
Right.
it was in draft form, the Human Rights Commission made a number of recommendations
Right.
to strengthen that
Strengthen
and to
that.
bring that in line with the international convention.
Yeah.
Now, since it's been passed, I haven't had time to review it to actually ascertain whether all our recommendations have been incorporated or not.
Yeah, because one of the key mistakes we find as a commercial attorney, I also find in going into certain access, we don't follow the totality of the
No,
spirit
we
of the
don't.
model law.
Exactly,
So
the spirit. That is the important
Yes.
thing. Great that you
we have
said
that issue in arbitration law, and I was finding it recently. Anyway, so you are a commissioner of the Human Rights Commission.
Yes.
Just tell us, what is your mandate? When can an ordinary citizen like me or anyone who's watching us can come to you? For what can we come to you? What is the mandate of Human Rights Commission?
Right. So the Human Rights Commission was established by an Act of Parliament, Act number 21 of 1996. And thereafter, after the 19th Amendment was passed in 2015, the Constitutional Council was established via the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and then all appointments to the commissions was thereafter are made by the Constitutional Council. So this makes the commissions independent. So we have the Human Rights Commission, Public Service Commission, the Bribery Commission, the National Police Commission. So we have many independent commissions. Now, the Human Rights Commission, we are independent and we report to Parliament. So we don't come under any specific ministry or, etc. The mandate of the Commission is to accept complaints of allegations of violations of fundamental rights. So if anyone feels that their fundamental right has been violated, then they can come and complain to us. We are also mandated to advise the government on law reform, on changing national laws to ensure that they are in line with international human rights laws and standards. We are also mandated to engage in public education, awareness raising on human rights. We can also visit places of detention where any person is deprived of liberty. We can also summon witnesses, we can summon documentation. So those are our powers and our mandate, broadly speaking.
Right. Now, you said anybody can complain of a violation or something of, they feel a violation.
Alleged violation,
or alleged
yes.
violation of a fundamental right.
That's
is
right.
this limited to the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, or is your mandate broader?
Yes, good question. Well, it certainly includes all the rights included in the fundamental rights chapter, but even in other instances, there could be instances where it could be brought under the equality provision. So the Human Rights Commission, while we also believe that it is important for Sri Lanka to abide by its international human rights obligations. So if we find that there is a certain right that has not been included, that is still violated, that is not protected, we actually would not ignore it. We would actually take that up and we would make recommendations for the alleged violation, for the remedy to be given. If there is law reform that has to be done by the government, we would then advocate for that. So we do take a broad perspective where rights are concerned.
Right. The fundamental rights chapter, where the Constitution enshrines certain fundamental rights, are you happy with these fundamental rights as something that has encompassed all human rights that people do need to exercise or have, or is there a lot of room for improvement?
So, for instance, the government started a constitutional reform process. And they set up this, the public representation, committee that went around the country and obtained views from the public. So, and they also set up the Constitutional Assembly and the different thematic subcommittees. So the Human Rights Commission, we went before the Public Representations Committee, we made representations. We also made representations to the subcommittee on fundamental rights. And what we said in our recommendations is that the fundamental rights chapter, or what we call the Bill of Rights, should be made broader. So for instance, the grounds of non-discrimination, we said, should be made broader. So you need to have like, right to privacy, the right not to be discriminated based on your sexual orientation and, sexual orientation. And so we actually advocated for the Bill of Rights, particularly the non-discrimination chapter, to be broadened, to give better protection for groups that are currently marginalized.
Right. Those are the only areas. You all don't see things like which are enshrined in Indian Constitution, like the right to life.
Of course, we did. Of course, that is a given. Of course, right to life. Yes.
Do we have right to education here?
No, we don't.
Yeah, but
no,
India
we don't.
does.
And yes, and also, I mean, what we have also been, the Commission has been advocating is for socio-economic rights to be also included.
Okay.
Now
the question is, now people can come and they will complain to you. What is the difference of their complaining to you, violation of one of those fundamental rights, and going to court straight away?
Right.
Going to Supreme Court straight away.
Good question. Because as you said, rightly said, if there is a violation of fundamental rights, you can actually file a petition in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Commission has been set up as an alternate mechanism, because going to court would be expensive, you would need to retain a lawyer, and it might also be a very time consuming and cumbersome process. So the Human Rights Commission is supposed to be an alternative mechanism, because when you come to us, it is free, you do not need a lawyer, and it is supposed to be quicker. Of course, we have to be honest and say what we have found, that is even our processes there are long delays, and that has been due to many reasons which we have tried to rectify since we were appointed. In 2015, we find that there are cases that have been delayed for years. Sometimes we get appeal letters from the complainants. The difference is that also you don't need a lawyer. It is supposed to be much easier for you. You will get assistance in filing a complaint if you do not, for instance, know what sort of supporting documents you have to provide. We will actually provide the advice. And if we find that the complaint does not fall within our mandate, then we would refer you to the relevant body and give advice.
Right. Now, what if a person has a grievance, which is not one of those fundamental rights, right? Are you taking such complaint, and are you able to process that through or not?
Yes. Now, for instance, if a person says that the person is differently abled, right, and the person has been discriminated against due to that disability, now you can argue that is not enshrined as a ground of non-discrimination in Article 12. But we would still accept that, because we believe that Sri Lanka has ratified the International Convention on the Protection of Persons with Disabilities. And therefore we need to also respect our international obligations, and also it violates equality. It violates Article 12(1). So therefore, yes, we would most definitely accept that complaint, because we believe that certain groups like persons with disabilities are discriminated against and are marginalized.
Okay. What are the areas, because a lot of people who are watching would want to know, because some of the areas, even I have found people who come, you can't go to Supreme Court on that. It's not one of the recognized fundamental rights. So what are the areas of at least the conventions we have ratified at Sri Lanka, like what you mentioned now, which rights are not enshrined in the Constitution as fundamental rights, but you can go into looking into? What are those areas? Can you just remember?
Well, what are those areas? I mean, persons with disabilities would be one.
Yeah.
But any also groups that are being marginalized. So even if that is
when
not...
you say groups marginalized, what does
So
that
for
mean?
instance, I mean, we have migrant workers who are being discriminated against. We have LGBTIQ persons who are discriminated against. We have groups like plantation workers. There are various groups whose rights are discriminated, and you might say, well, the particular right is not included in the fundamental rights chapter. But we would still, as I said, take a broad view, because discrimination is discrimination, falls under Article 12.
So basically what you're saying is, if we file any area which we feel a discrimination.
But it has to be by state. I mean, we cannot take complaints against private entities, so the corporate sector we can't. If it's a private dispute like land dispute, we can't. It has to be against a state entity that has violated any one of the rights. So, you know, it could, equality, or it could be torture. So
basically anything that you can file against the state, you feel that your right is violated, you can come to y'all, and then you all look into it along with the documents which Sri Lanka has ratified, and then see whether there's a case. But you brought a very interesting point in saying it's not against the private sector. But as you know, in the private sector also, tremendous amount, especially disability, discrimination on disabilities and all that things are happening. So in Sri Lanka, you don't have such a mandate. But anywhere in the world, is there any country?
But there have been recommendations made as part of the constitutional reform process to also make the Bill of Rights actually applicable to the private sector as well.
Right.
Because you would have to change that.
Any other country?
Well, in other countries, you have legislation where you can actually, for discrimination by private actors, you can file action. But then sometimes in some countries, filing action also means that you need to have the legal means to do so. Right? So in Sri Lanka, for instance, even if you have specific laws that, you know, to file private suit, for instance, we have very little access to legal aid. In Sri Lanka, legal aid, I mean, you have the Legal Aid Commission, which provides legal aid for certain kinds of issues. But private, you know, kind of legal aid clinics, etc., very few in Sri Lanka. So for a private citizen to file action in court would be something that would be tremendously, I think, financially, the burden, it's burdensome.
Right. So what can you do to improve that?
Well, legal aid is a very important thing. I mean, that's also an important right which we have actually recommended be included in the, you know, in our recommendations on constitutional reform. We have. That is actually something I think that the state has to provide, but also we need to bring about that culture, because once again, the legal fraternity, because if you look at other countries, they have the bar associations have a very robust kind of, you know, setup where they provide. You have legal aid clinics where lawyers volunteer a lot of their time. You have law firms.
Correct. They do pro bono work.
A lot of pro bono work they do for this kind. So that, I think...
So where you mean to say, when you have that kind of a professional law firms and associations of lawyers and government stepping in and putting a lot of resources for legal aid, what happens, I know for example in England, is that when a person who doesn't have money comes to legal aid, there is resources to retain the best lawyer for that and get the basic justice. And this sort of thing is
so that is severely lacking in Sri Lanka. So that is something I think the legal fraternity needs to in a sense, they need to provide and expend resources and time to create that culture of pro bono work. Because one of the reasons, because lack of access to legal aid also impacts on, for instance, even let's say prison overcrowding. Because in Sri Lanka, we find that a large population of our prison, a large percentage of our prison population happen to be remandees. Now, many of these remandees, they are remanded, they can't action,
pay some money.
They can't pay their bail. Some of them don't have access to lawyers, so they don't even know what happens in court. Right? And you might find even by the death penalty is concerned, it might be that a person gets on death row because the person didn't have access to good legal aid. Now, this you have found in other countries. Now, for instance, in the US, particularly in the past 12 months, many people who have been on death row have been released because it is found that at the time they didn't have access to good legal counsel, and there is evidence that actually exonerates them. So even 3 months ago, I found a man was released after 23 years, I think. So this is why legal aid is so important, because it impacts on other aspects, like, for instance, as I said, the
human rights
and prison system as well.
Yes. Okay, you brought into a very, you mentioned a very important question about position about this death penalty.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of arguments in different countries whether death penalty should be there, should not be there. As far as looking at human rights of human are concerned, does the state have the right to kill, the license to kill? They do get the license to kill, certain states, certain countries, when it is legislated. But does the state has a license to kill? I'll couple this with a statement that one of the Republican Texan Republican senators was saying. He said that our rights does not come from the Constitution, our rights come from God. Therefore, you don't have a right to kill. These are certain states in US who are opposing death penalty. What is your opinion on this?
The opinion of the Commission is that on the 1st of January 2016, yes, 2016, we wrote to His Excellency the President. And we actually called upon His Excellency to abolish the death penalty in Sri Lanka. And we called for Sri Lanka to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Because the second optional protocol is about the abolition of the death penalty. And the reasons we gave are that now the arguments for the death penalty is that it acts as a deterrent.
Yes.
You find there's been research done in many other contexts which show that it doesn't actually act as a deterrent. And often you find it is the poor people who end up on death row because, as I said, they don't have access to good legal counsel. And also death penalty, being on the death penalty and being on death row for a long time is also now thought to be a cruel and unusual punishment. It's understood to be torture. So for all these reasons, we actually called for the abolition of the death penalty, and also there could be mistakes made in the justice system process, right? So the wrong person could actually be also sentenced, and once a life is lost, you can't gain it back.
But conversely, people, if you could remember the rape case in India, the gang rape case of Vidya,
yes,
people were calling that death penalty should be brought not only for murder, but also for situations like rape. And I have female attorneys in Sri Lanka who are saying this should be done. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, in India, even since then, I mean, we've had the Vidya case. They brought about a commission. They brought about various reform processes after that. Even now, we still see more reporting perhaps of violence against women and girl children. And that's what I said, bringing about the death penalty really will not have an impact because it's about the mindset. And it's about impunity, right? Because if you think you can get away with it, you will do it. And you find, and that sense of impunity is deeply embedded in people's minds, because you find in many cases, for instance, the perpetrator lives right next to the victim. He rapes the victim and then leaves the victim and goes off. So I always wonder, how do they think they're not going to get caught? Because that sense of impunity and also the sense of male entitlement, where you view women as objects, right? Where you can perpetrate any violence because they don't have value in society, therefore you can get away scot-free. So those are the things we need to tackle. Even if you bring about the death penalty, if a man still sees a woman as some sort of an object on which violence can be perpetrated freely, is that going to help?
Right. So the alternative you gave for abolishing death penalty is life imprisonment?
Yes, you can have life imprisonment, and also in some cases that might be, the perpetrators might also have various psychological disorders actually. When those who commit very violent crimes, you find that can be sociopathic, they can be psychopathic, etc. So those things also need to be looked into.
Right. Ambika Sadgunathan, thank you very much for that discussion in the broadest based on human rights. Is there any last words you want to leave to our viewers?
I think the most important thing, I think, for protection of human rights is for each citizen to have a sense of civic responsibility and always keep in mind that you must care when someone else's right is being violated, because that undermines generally respect for the rule of law in a country, and it can ultimately also impact you adversely.
Thank you very much once again for joining Law and Order.
Thank you.
So our discussion today on Law and Order was human rights in a very broad basis, and my guest today was Ambika Sadgunathan, Commissioner of Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka and a specialist in that area of law. We'll join you next week at the same time for another program on Law and Order. If you miss our programs, go to our website channeli.lk, pick Law and Order from the drop-down menu, and you can watch our shows all